Let's return to the UK's changing relationship with China after the Foreign Secretary told Sky's Sophie Ridge that Britain needs to be careful in its dealings with Beijing. It follows the government's decision to remove Huawei from the UK's 5G network and Britain's offer of citizenship to nearly 3 million British overseas nationals living in Hong Kong. Joining me now is Chief Leader Writer at The Observer and former Senior Policy Advisor to Ed Miliband, Sonia Sodha, and Director of the independent think tank Bright Blue and former Conservative Policy Advisor Ryan Shorthouse. Good afternoon to you both. The Foreign Secretary urging caution in our dealings. We need to be careful in how we deal with China. How do we do that, Sonia?
Well, I think that's a really, really difficult question. We're sort of caught between a rock and a hard place. I mean, I think, first of all, we saw that really extraordinary interview with the Chinese ambassador on the Andrew Marr show this morning. Really, really disturbing, where he just sort of flat out denied the mounting evidence that there's a genocide happening against Uyghur Muslims in China that's being perpetrated by the Chinese government. And then we've got the whole Huawei issue as well. So I think there are really important questions about what it means to take a tough stance with China, given all this context. There's also all the stuff that's going on in Hong Kong. And, it feels like where sort of the alignment is moving is very much that there's pressure coming from the US and others that we do take a harder line on the 5G issue and Huawei. But I'm also really interested in what is the international community going to do, given that there is mounting evidence of these terrible, terrible crimes being committed against the Uyghur people.
Ryan Shorthouse, what we did learn from the Foreign Secretary was that there'll be a statement to the House of Commons tomorrow on Britain's extradition treaty with Hong Kong. What can we expect, do you think?
Well, obviously, the sort of new security law that the Hong Kong government has put in place is in violation of the 1997 one country, two systems policy that was put in place. So, the UK does have to take a tougher line. It's obviously opened up immigration routes to British nationals in Hong Kong. And I think it's right to go further. China is a major global economic power. We can't stop trading with them, but we can be stronger, particularly in regards to Hong Kong, but also the human rights abuses of Muslims in Western provinces of China, which, the video that was on the Andrew Marr show today, which the ambassador just dismissed, has been verified by numerous intelligence sources in the West. So it's right that there's more xeno-skepticism amongst British policymakers and politicians towards China. And, I think the government needs to go further. And probably we'll see that with the Foreign Secretary tomorrow in how it responds to Hong Kong, because what's happening there is gravely concerning. That is a country which, it's a beacon. It should be a beacon of economic progress, of democracy. But after many years, the kind of freedoms that the Hong Kong people enjoy have been eroded. And this security law that's now been passed is really a step too far, and the British government needs to take a stand.
The Chinese ambassador, as you said, Sonia, totally dismissing accusations of human rights abuses against Uyghur Muslims and suggesting that the footage shown was fake. Also warning of a resolute response to any move by Britain to sanction Chinese officials, and accusing Britain of dancing to America's tune. So how does China respond to what we are now seeing as potentially a more tough stance against them?
Well, I think we saw their response this morning from the Chinese ambassador. I mean, it was literally just to flat out deny that these crimes are taking place, even though that there is mounting evidence, thanks to the bravery of local journalists on the ground, thanks to the bravery of Uyghur individuals who are speaking out at huge risk to themselves, and really desperate stories that we're hearing about what's going on in that province. So, the Chinese government just seems to be kind of flat out denial and to just say it's not happening. And that just isn't good enough. The international community has to take much firmer action. It can't just sit by and let this happen. And, you know, this is not a new thing that's going on. There has been mounting evidence in recent months and years. It's just that it feels now people are finally sort of starting to kind of take notice. And so I think it is really the moment where the international community has to act, because we saw that demonstration of denial from the Chinese government this morning, and it just does not wash. I'm sorry, it just doesn't.
How then, Ryan, does the government tread this delicate line between taking a tougher stance? Andrew Bridgen speaking to us just a short time ago, saying that Britain must not be held to ransom by China, but they are an important strategic partner. How do we strike that balance?
It's a difficult one, but I think, you know, a lot of people would say during the coalition government, you know, the Osborne-Cameron strategy was very much to kind of pronounce this sort of new golden age in the relationship between China and the UK, which was heavily focused on kind of trade. And there is some evidence that actually, you know, the more you trade with countries, obviously there are economic benefits to that, but there are also other benefits, greater understanding between the countries, greater alignment with democratic values, greater adherence to the rule of law. So, you know, there is some evidence around that, but obviously, you know, it can't be just narrowly focused on economic trade. It also has to take into account human rights abuses. And I think the government is right to not just focus on the kind of economic stuff and look at the human rights abuses, particularly in the Western provinces and in Hong Kong. So I think that balance you know, is better than it was during the coalition days.
Let's move to the Prime Minister's first year in office now, Sonia. He's given an interview today, and he's talked about national lockdowns and comparing them to the nuclear deterrent. What do you make of that?
I think it's a really dodgy analogy, actually. You know, we've never had to use a nuclear deterrent, thank goodness, and neither would we anticipate needing to, hopefully. Whereas we've had to impose a national lockdown for the last 3 months. So it's a really weird analogy. I think the Prime Minister clearly wants to communicate confidence to the public and to encourage them to go out, to make use of new freedoms, and that's where this sort of language is coming from. But the problem is, I feel like he's sort of making fake promises, because everyone hopes that there's no need for another national lockdown. Everyone hopes that the government's test track and trace system will be robust enough actually to sort of essentially mean that you only have to go for very, very sort of small scale hyperlocal lockdowns, because there's so much tracking going on that the restrictions can be put in place in a very small area to try and prevent kind of further spread. But we don't know that it's going to be effective enough, and we really don't know what's going to happen. There's a lot of uncertainty with this virus. A lot of public health experts are very worried about a second wave, and a national lockdown may be needed. I just don't think that the Prime Minister is in a position to promise us that, you know, it's like a nuclear deterrent. Everyone hopes we won't have it, but there is a chance that it will be needed. So I think what he's trying to do here is just to try and kind of assuage the fears of the public at this time. But I also think he needs to treat the public like adults, and you know, people know that it may well be on the cards, and that is something that we have to live with, unfortunately.
He also, in the interview, Ryan Shorthouse, is trying to set out his vision for the country, talking about being a transformative government, talking about massive opportunity in this country to do things differently. But this pandemic has knocked his premiership off course in ways that he could never have imagined, not least of all his own near-death experience. How much of this is him trying to reset now when, as Sonia says, we're not even part of the way through this pandemic? We are told, we are warned by the scientists that there will be waves of COVID for years to come.
Yeah, I mean, you know, the Prime Minister started his premiership, his new premiership, thinking that it was about his levelling up agenda, taking Britain to a new era, post-Brexit. But of course, his government is now defined completely by how it's responding to COVID in terms of its ability to keep down the death rate and and make sure the NHS is delivering, but also in the long term, how it's going to recover from what is one of the deepest recessions that we've experienced for a very long time. So, I think the Prime Minister has some interesting policies, particularly in the education space and also around kind of regional policy. But to be honest, whether that will be a priority when COVID is going to be with us, not only the kind of immediate health problem, but the long-term economic consequences of it for a very long time. The frank truth is that if you look at the statistics on excess deaths, then England in particular performs very badly compared to other countries. And so, it's obviously a very difficult, challenging situation. But the government, compared to other countries in Europe, doesn't seem to have delivered as well in keeping the death rate down. And there may be all sorts of reasons for that and lessons to be learned. Sometimes those reasons are outside the government's control. But, at the moment, it doesn't seem to be that the government has performed particularly well on COVID relative to other countries. We'll have to see what happens in terms of the economy, in terms of employment levels and growth rate levels. But, that's really how the public are going to judge this government, how it's responded to the health and economic implications of COVID.
We also had that admission this week, didn't we, from the Chief Scientific Advisor, Sir Patrick Vallance, that the outcomes had not been good in this country. I just want to talk, before we run out of time, about Russia as well. Some strong language from the Foreign Secretary on Russia today at Sonia Sodha, but also from the Shadow Foreign Secretary, Lisa Nandy, admitting that Labour got its approach wrong on Russia.
Yeah, and I think that was a really welcome admission from Lisa Nandy. I think it's something that she said at the time. She obviously wasn't part of the shadow cabinet during Jeremy Corbyn's leadership of the Labour Party, but I think it was a very welcome and frank admission. And actually, if you look at some of the studies that have been done on why Labour did so badly in the election at the end of last year, one of the things that sort of contributed to this idea that Jeremy Corbyn wasn't a strong leader, his response to the Salisbury poisonings really did do Labour a lot of damage at the time. So I think it was something that sort of Labour needed to say. I think it's authentic because I think there are lots of people in Keir Starmer's shadow cabinet who would have felt quite very uncomfortable with Jeremy Corbyn's approach to Russia and thinks that, the response needs to be harder. But I think, we've just talked about China and now we're talking about Russia, and there's been all sorts of stuff coming out this week about Russia sort of potentially hacking solutions around a vaccine, etc. We've been seeing stories coming out in recent months about Russia's involvement in the American election, potentially in the UK elections. And, it really does underline what a fragile, unstable international world order we're now living in. We've got serious problems with China and serious problems with Russia as well.
OK, Sonia Sodha, Ryan Shorthouse, thank you both very much indeed for joining us this lunchtime.